All right, class. So today we're joined in our virtual visit by Greg Heilman, and he is a program manager of global information security for the Walt Disney Company. And he's agreed to speak with us today to talk about what he does, also talk about his fandom and kind of his path to where he is today. And then also he has a podcast that where they talk to local actors in the around the Seattle area, Seattle, Washington area. That he mentioned something on a previous podcast that I want to get into with him because I think it's very, very interesting. I think people will find it interesting looking at where everything is now with streaming and Disney Plus and Amazon, and where different things are going as far as the entertainment and what we would typically see as theatrical releases and things like that. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Greg. And Greg, if you could start out by telling us just kind of your experience as a fan of Disney, how you got into it, and then general overview of your journey to how where you are working with the company today.
Sure. Thanks, Cody, and thanks for having me on. I'm always happy to talk about anything Disney with anybody. So this is great. Yeah. So from a fan perspective, I think it all comes down to the parks. When I was, I guess, 7 years old, we first went to Disney World, Walt Disney World. So that would have been 1976, middle of the bicentennial, and one one theme park, two resorts, three if you count the golf resort hotel, and it was just it made such an impression then, and then we had gone subsequent years and watched the parks grow. And I remember thinking, specifically one time I was at the parks, man, it would really be cool to be a part of making somebody feel the way I feel when I'm at a park. You don't think about the outside world, all these little problems that you have kind of go away. And as a kid you think all your problems are the biggest things in the world. But yeah, and that's really when it started. And then I kept thinking as I went through my life through school and then college, what I could do or how I could get in, because I wasn't really an artist or anything like that. So it was always in the back of my head. So I just kind of went through school, graduated, then got into the workspace. And I thought, well, I could get a part-time job at the Disney store, because that was in Philadelphia. I think Philadelphia had maybe the second or third Disney store in the country. And that didn't really work out because I had a full-time job. So it was I kind of put that on the back burner, but it's always in the back of my head. So as I went through my career, I started out with an undergraduate degree in accounting and then moved into IT. Did a lot of kind of network design and builds and things like that, and did a lot of traveling and had a really pretty successful and fulfilling, outside of Disney career. But it's always been in the back of my head. So I started when I was looking for a job at one point. I started just looking on LinkedIn and looking at Disney people. And I found one person that worked in Seattle, of all places. So my wife and I had talked about, well, could we live in Southern California? Could we live in Orlando? And it's hot and humid, all the kind of the weather stuff. And then her family was from Seattle. So it was kind of one of those things. It was light bulb that I thought, gee, if I could get out to Seattle and maybe network with some of these Disney people, it might, something might happen. So I got a job with Amazon back when I was in Pennsylvania, and Amazon being based in Seattle, I thought, well, this is the perfect opportunity. So I'm gonna work at Amazon. So I was a program manager there. Um, Amazon's always willing to relocate people. So I talked to them about relocating to Seattle, all with kind of the intention in the back of my head of using this as a path to get to Disney. And sure enough, I reached out, that one person that was in Seattle. I reached out on LinkedIn, sent him um, an email through LinkedIn, and he responded to me. And it was funny enough, when I was interviewing with Amazon and I came out to Seattle, that's the first time I had met this person as well. We went out to Starbucks for coffee, started talking, and there was nothing at that point that Disney had that I could fit. But it was, I just kind of played the long game then, kept my contacts up with him, made a few more contacts. And funny enough, like 2 years after that, something opened up at Disney that I was qualified for. And through this networking and all that, it worked out. And that person ended up becoming my hiring manager. So it was kind of a interesting long roundabout way to get there. And the cool thing was, when I got hired into this enterprise architecture group. And it was a corporate group that was not aligned with any of the segments. So you have parks and studios and media networks, and uh, this group drove technology from a corporate perspective. So looked at technology trends and wrote up papers on what the how the company could benefit from it. So virtual reality, when that was just kind of starting out, we would write papers and hold classes on educating the people around the company on these things. So it was a pretty cool place to be, because I was able to interact with not just the corporate people, but people in every segment. So I could, one day I'd be on the phone with somebody from Lucas, the next day I was on the phone with somebody from Parks. So it was really um, a kind of really fun. I mean, it was a fun group to be in, and we were driving technology change throughout the company, which was really nice. As part of a reorganization 2 years ago, our group at that point just kind of disbanded, and we all went into different teams around the company. And I ended up in global information security, having a security background, as well as part of my work, outside Disney, helped with that alignment, and that's where I've been since. So right now I'm part of security operations within global information security, and in that role I manage our team's budget. I manage programs for security tools that we roll out and manage. Um, Again, also working with segments of the around the company. So it's nice. I like being in that corporate role. I guess the dream is, you want to be an Imagineer. I mean, I think everybody kind of in the back of their head says, "Man, being an Imagineer would be awesome." Um, at this point, with everything going on with COVID, I'm probably in a much better position, job security wise, than I would be as an Imagineer. Though that would still be, I think, a fun place to be. Uh, I'm happy, definitely, with where I'm at that kind of corporate position, for sure.
Well, that's interesting, and I've definitely given thought over the years of, hey, can you use your skill set to consult with the company a little bit, and have that, like you said, have that Imagineering title for, on a consulting basis or something. That what so with information technology, um, and I'm going to ask you to give the students more information about that. So, like, kind of what you do sort of on a day-to-day basis, or I should say, what the group does as well. Um, because it seems to me that obviously during the pandemic, everything is, you have to be so careful, and your security is of the utmost importance at this time. But even pre-pandemic, with the things that the company has done, it seems like that takes a forefront, kind of in pushing what the company can do in the future of the company. Things like getting into streaming, and what they're doing with when people visit parks and visit the resorts and things like that. So could you give a little more information, kind of what the group is responsible for, and then get into some of the, I know you talked about some of the things that you oversee, but if there's any day-to-day operations that the students should know about.
Sure, absolutely. So. security operations, that's really around making sure that nobody can get into the network, that we don't, the viruses don't come in and spread throughout, and making sure that personal data is protected. That's, I think, probably one of the biggest responsibilities the group has, is to make sure that guest personal data is not compromised in any way. Because you see, a number of, whether it was, when you had the Sony hack where they got, where the hackers got access to, media, some films. Then you've got the Target, incident where people's personal data, and you read about a new thing every day where somebody's personal data is being leaked out because of a hack. So that's probably the biggest responsibility. Um, some of it is identifying what hackers are out there using, what methods they're using to try to get personal data, and making sure that we're ahead of them when it comes to, preventing that kind of access. Um, there's the, enabling two-factor authentication on websites, and making sure that accounts are, consistent from, across the board. So there's the, when you sign into the Disney store, it's the same account you use to sign into Walt Disney World and all that, making sure that is, um, kept and contained in a protective shell. Um, Also, we have people in the group that go out and try to hack the company. So we try to make sure that we can, um, you know, go through what hackers would go through to try to get into the company, and making sure that any holes are filled. Um, there's one of the programs is an anti-phishing campaign to make sure that we don't, when people get emails, it's they don't click on links and click on attachments they don't know about. So there's the education piece of that, where we make sure that employees are educated on what to do when they see something, what might look suspicious, and that if something is, clicked on, then we contain that as quickly as possible. So that's kind of the general responsibilities of information security, from a day-to-day perspective. So one of the things, I'm responsible for is as a program manager. So I'm not, though I have a technical background, my job is not technical at this point. So I manage the tools that we have, to keep an inventory of all of our devices, to make sure that our firewalls are patched, and access lists are maintained. Make sure that we've got antivirus on all of our systems, things like that. Those things. So we have our group owns the tools that manage those things, and I manage kind of those tools, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think, especially for especially for students now, I think it is more important that they understand, um, how to secure their company, how to secure their consumers, because you do see so many of these like attacks on companies, and you've seen the things that have happened from those, and kind of the fallout for those companies. So it is, and moving forward, it only becomes more and more important with, keeping your consumers and keeping your fans, keeping your, that consumption, that repeat consumption. Um, so it's very, very interesting what you're doing, and, the the it's just, I keep going back to thinking, when something happens, when there's a hack or someone's able to get into a server, um, the public also has this perception of, almost like, how did this happen, right? And it's this idea of, you're working behind the scenes, and the security of the company doesn't really get talked about unless there is a breach and people are
Hmm.
saying something negative about it, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I remember having a conversation when I was thinking about a year and a half ago of what I wanted to do in Disney. I'd spent so long trying to get to Disney. I never really gave much thought of what I would do career progression wise once I got there. So I was talking to somebody and I thought, well, what I really want to be is part of um, was it contribute actively to the positive guest experience, which meaning that hey, you're looking at an attraction and you're looking at something, you can put your finger on it and say I had something to do with building that. And then I started to think about the role I'm in security and thinking, well, it doesn't necessarily actively contribute to a positive guest experience, but it prevents a negative guest experience, which it's a nuanced difference, but it's just as important because people trust Disney with their information, whether it's shopping, whether it's going, around the park. You're flashing your magic band everywhere to buy things and um, get through fast passes and on attractions. And while the while you might be tracked through the park, you as a person are not. Your magic band is, and the statistics are used for various things. Disney's a very data driven company, but none of that data is never tied back to a person, so that personal data can't get leaked out. So it's really important to make sure that's in place. So I think, yeah, I think the reputation of the company is based a lot on the fact that the data can be secure.
And I, outside of this class, I teach our sport marketing classes, and my area of research is group behavior and rivalry, and so we spend a lot of time researching and talking about that the positive experiences people talk about for a certain amount of time. If there's a negative experience, people talk about that for much longer, and
Hmm.
that tends to spread so much quicker, so much farther than a positive experience. And everyone equates um, these positive feelings and um, experiences with the Disney company, and especially at their parks. And so it is a vital aspect of the company that over here you have kind of the Imagineers, or I guess the creative aspect, if you will, that is trying to create all of these memories for people. And over here, you have this side of the company that is vitally important in protecting for this other aspect. So people can enjoy those things and um, they don't feel threatened by them. Um, you mentioned people walking around and how much now is linked to a person's magic band at the parks. And I don't want you to speak on anything you shouldn't speak on or can't speak on. So please let me know if you can't. But did your group, what kind of had they had to do with the security of the magic bands and having people be able to not just get on rides and into the parks, but now they're linked to hotel rooms and they're linked to credit cards and everything?
Sure. Well, there's a number of laws and regulations that dictate what you can do with personal data, um, credit card data, personal, other personal data. And there's different levels of that. So we make sure we have a group within information security that's compliance. That's just compliance to make sure that we follow those rules. So without getting into the details of how it's done, um, we make sure that those rules are followed. And there's encryption on links, and there's segregations of networks and things like that. So you can something as simple as you connect to the Wi-Fi in the parks, that you can't connect to the corporate network through that Wi-Fi. It's an isolated network, and the rides and shows and things like that are on isolated networks, in order to make sure that they're not, there's no possible way to get from where you are in the park to that personal data. So yeah, it's something that's worked on every day, and it's trying to use data to make decisions, but making sure that the data that's used is not any of that personal data. You're more of, um, I guess, represented as an account, but not anything personal that can be tied to um, anything else, any of your personal data.
Yeah. A couple more questions before we transition, and these are more dealing with the consumers and the fandom aspect of it. But when you go to a park or you go to any of the resorts, um, what's your experience walking around the parks? In other words, do you walk around and think, I have to do with this. I am partly responsible for providing this experience for people. And how does that make you feel?
I mean, honestly, it makes me feel really good because, like I said, it comes back to that feeling when I was a kid of wanting to be, even if it was a little part of. I used to say, even if I'm like a little part of in the back of creating this environment that feels this way, and yeah, it's great. It's a big company, and there's so many people, so many gears that are spinning to make sure that it all works. It's a really good feeling knowing that we're part of that part of something that creates happiness and for people.
Yeah, and that's just as I said at the beginning, people just associate positivity and these positive experiences with the company. Um, in the parks, movies, entertainment, every segment of the company, um, people have such strong brand awareness, but such strong brand loyalty that happens because they've had such positive experiences and have avoided any overly negative experiences.
Yeah, and it's funny. I see when people come out, and I'll use, was it last year or the year before, where they came out with the announcement they were going to charge for parking at the resorts
Mhm.
in Florida, and there are announcements like that when you get this negative wave of this is ridiculous. They're a corporate, blah blah blah. Um, and I have a bunch of things that go through my mind when something like that happens. First of all, the idea that, okay, first of all, at the end of the day, it is a corporation that has to report to its shareholders.
Mhm.
It needs to make money. We talk about, layoffs and things, and the shareholders that demand double-digit growth year over year. And when you've had a good year, how do you do that if you can't make more revenue? You cut expenses. So there's that business side of it. Um, and then there's the part that, well, they're upset because they care.
Yeah.
There's so many people that care so deeply about this company that they're super passionate about it, and really they get upset because they care about it
Yeah.
so much. If so, that usually, outweighs the whole business thing in my head. But um, I will say every once in a while I've joked around if I'm at a park and I see somebody, open a door with a foot or something like that, and I start to think, man, that's why we don't have a higher travel budget or something like that. But um, you know, but overall, it's that feeling that it's that it's more positive than negative, which is really nice.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you said they get upset because of the feelings they have, and it is a measure of fandom. And
Hmm.
this being a class about fans, of what does it mean to be fans, and the other research that I do about fandom and how do you interact with different groups, and we've looked at how do people interact with Disney and how do they interact with other entertainment brands. That it is all part of fandom, and that people feel as though they have ownership over everything that happens, which is great. That is if you're a corporation, that's what you want. That's what you want
Hmm.
your customers to feel is ownership over something. And that includes, positive outcomes and outcomes that could at times seem a little more uncomfortable for
Yep.
the corporation. So I want to transition um, on your podcast, Heilman and Haver. And again, it's a podcast talking about Well, instead of me describing it, why don't you briefly describe what that podcast is, what you two do on a weekly basis?
Sure. So, an acting friend of mine. So I've been since we moved out here to Washington. I've gotten involved in local theater, and been in a number of shows and met some great people. One of them, Matt Haver, and I played brothers in Agatha Christie production a couple of years ago, and have just remained friends. And we decided to start this podcast, especially with the pandemic. There's no theaters open, so people are just kind of dying for some taste of theater
Mhm.
and cinema and things like that. So we decided to start this podcast where we interview local actors and directors. Um, we talk about so it's a stage and screen podcast. So one segment is the in the spotlight segment where we talk to an actor or director about something unique that has to do with them. Then we have a segment called In the Mix where we mix up a beverage, a cocktail that has to do with something either specific that we talk about with that guest that we have on the show, or a specific news item. Um, and the news item is one of my favorite segments because it tackles something. It's like a roundtable panel discussion of something that has to do with Hollywood, or eventually we've done all Hollywood topics so far, but it'll be stage or screen. Um, I think the first one we did, we talked about the new diversity requirements that the Oscars are going to have for Best Picture nominees. We talked about on our latest podcast, we had talked about de-aging technology in Hollywood, from the X-Men movies to Marvel and Tron Legacy, and then most recently The Irishman. I think the one you're referring to, Cody, is in our second episode where we talked about the U.S. versus Paramount decision, the history of that, and all of that. So I believe if yeah, we can get into. You wanted to get into that a little bit
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. And the so can you kind of when I was an undergraduate, I did a paper and a little bit of research on antitrust and how that affected Major League Baseball in different ways. Um, but yeah, in the podcast, in that segment, you three talked about the implications of that court case and the outcome of the court case and potential implications for streaming services. So
Sure.
can you start out kind of giving the students a brief overview of what that court case was?
Absolutely. So back in the and you may have heard of the old studio system in
Mm.
Hollywood. So you had these major studios, Paramount, RKO, a number of others. Disney at that point was kind of a almost a second tier studio because they just started out. But it was back in the days of the moguls. You had the newspaper barons and all these big corporations that would just run roughshod over everything. So here you have these major studios, and what they would do is um, either own the distribution chain. So you have a studio that would own its own theaters, RKO or Paramount or whoever, or for theaters that they didn't own, they would implement a number of kind of monopolistic or oligarchistic um, things, such as blocking where you would, if you wanted to show Gone with the Wind, for instance, they would make sure that if you wanted to buy Gone with the Wind to show at your theater, you also had to buy this entire other package of films to show with Gone with the Wind. So they'd kind of force you to do these things as a independent theater that would, if you didn't comply, you'd probably go out of business because you weren't going to be able to show Gone with the Wind where all the other major theaters could do that, or spend a ton of money and be kind of beholden to that. So and there was a number of other things, but um, there were some lawsuits that started and eventually made it up to the Supreme Court. That was part of the U.S. versus Paramount, and it was against every studio. Paramount was listed as the main defendant because they were the largest studio at the time. And basically, what came out of that, it broke up the studio system. One of the biggest pieces of that we focused on in the podcast was that studios had to divest their interest in or sell off their theaters that they owned, so that they could not then own the full distribution chain from production down to distribution. And that remained, kind of the law of the land, up until this past August when that ruling was overturned. But it's now also because, and this is something that I started to think about with, because I knew about this ruling, and as I'm watching Netflix make their own films and Disney make their own films and release them directly to streaming, I started to think about this. Well, why is that legal? If you've got
Hmm.
this U.S. versus Paramount Supreme Court ruling that you're not allowed to own the distribution chain, how can they do that? So I started to do a lot of research into that and found that that was never applied. The ruling stood and could have applied to television and streaming, but they just never. The Department of Justice just never did. And then finally, it's been overturned this past August. So that opens up any number of things that you could happen. It's then there's no more question of Disney releasing films direct to Disney Plus or Netflix doing the same. I think Mulan, and we did it in the context of Mulan because I believe
Hmm.
Mulan was the first film that was released to directly to streaming on the exact same day that
Yeah.
it was also released to theaters, limited as that release was with the pandemic. So yeah, it opens up a number of questions that we talked about, around what studios are going to do moving forward. And now you see Disney's releasing um, Soul, right,
Yeah.
directly to streaming, and it's starting to really happen more and more.
Well, in the reorganization of the entertainment segment that people have been reading about lately, that of this reorganization and with a focus more on streaming, and there's kind of two aspects of this, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I could talk about this for a long time because I just
So can
don't
I.
know. I'm really interested in it, and I don't feel like I know a tremendous amount about it. I know enough to ask questions and hopefully the right questions, but there's one aspect of like companies, entertainment companies, if they're going straight to streaming from a financial perspective, of how viable is it for them to, yes, they're controlling their distribution and they're kind of creating in a way their own like virtual theaters, if you will. I didn't think about that until I was listening to your podcast a few weeks ago, that they're kind of creating these virtual theaters and they're controlling the distribution. um, from a financial perspective, how kind of viable is that for especially companies that, I mean, when you look at what Avengers Endgame did and you look at some of their other what people call tentpole movies, like where kind of is the balance between those traditional releases and this new, what seems like this new trend of releasing straight to streaming platforms. And I read the Bob Iger or listened to the Bob Iger book a few times where he talked about Disney Plus and kind of looking at a new metric for measuring success. But that's something that I think is real interesting. What's kind of the viability of this from a financial perspective, in your opinion?
Well, from and we did it in the context of Mulan, and I think we even mentioned somebody had done the math
Hmm.
that you took the number of subscribers multiplied by the $30 that they had to pay for Mulan, because that was that odd one where
Hmm.
you had that premiere access. Um, and when you do the math, it turns out that the revenue that they made would have put Mulan in an opening weekend second behind, I think it was Infinity War, for revenue for an
Hmm.
opening weekend, and they didn't have to share any of that with theaters. So there's there's less of a difference, um, between gross and net when you don't have to share that with the theaters. Now it changes then with these other films that, like Soul. We talked about Soul. That's going to be released, directly to streaming, but there's no additional cost for that. So that money is taken or allocated directly from the monthly. We pay. I think we did the ESPN Plus, Hulu,
Mhm.
and Disney, package for 12.99 a month. So the millions of people or whatever that are subscribers, they're having then to allocate that from that monthly, income, or that monthly um, payment from subscribers to those. And you don't know. I guess you can tell who's watching it. So if you can kind of make an allocation that way, but it's really an unknown
Yeah.
because it's a brand new model of trying to determine what what amount of the customers are watching it that weekend, so that you make that allocation. And you really then, I mean, how do you compare how Soul does versus how something that's released to theaters? And I think during the pandemic, it makes sense to do that, to do this, because you don't want to keep putting everything on the back burner
Mhm.
waiting, because we don't know how long we're going to be in this situation. um, but it's really going to be interesting after we come out of
Yeah.
this and theaters are back open. And you mentioned the Disney announcement. I think it was interesting the way they worded that, in that they didn't commit to doing a streaming first, but what
Yeah.
they did was said that they're going to put the decisions in the hands of this group of people,
Mhm.
um, that are going to determine whether it's better to release to theaters or better release to streaming. And I think the implication is that it's a streaming first thing, but I think they stayed away from explicitly stating that. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see once we come out of this, what that balance is, and
Yeah.
how that's going to impact not just theaters, but when you talk about film revenues and things like that, because then you're really not comparing Avengers Endgame to you know um, Black Widow when that comes out, because it might be released differently.
Yeah. Well, and there, a lot of those, you also talked about a lot of the metrics are proprietary. So people aren't, it's not the same. You're not comparing oranges to oranges, you know,
Hmm.
um, in a lot of cases, because everybody has their own proprietary ways of doing that. And I remember the first example that I saw was the Universal Trolls 2, where, because of the success of Trolls 2 releasing digitally, then they made their statement about, potentially doing digital at the same time, or streaming at the same time as traditional release. And that caused the issue with, I believe it was AMC first, and then
AMC, yep. They
Regal,
said,
and
yeah, AMC said we're gonna ban, or we're gonna boycott all Universal films.
yeah.
I think that was that whole, yeah.
And I remember at the time thinking, this is really interesting. And is is this a misstep, or is this like a path to something else? And then I think it was a month or two later, I think there was like a joint kind of agreement between Universal and the theater chains of what they were going to do. Um, Another thing that you mentioned that I had not thought about this at all is, we have these kind of virtual theaters now, but in the case of Mulan, they released Mulan on Disney Plus with Premier Access. And I don't know if the intent was people knew it was going to be released on Disney Plus with non-premium access in December, or if that was something that just happened and so then they had to do that. But at the beginning of October, I believe, somewhere at the beginning of October, Mulan also started. It was being released like on Movies Anywhere, and you could purchase it on different platforms and everything. And so that, along with what you talked about with, could entertainment companies actually start purchasing brick and mortar theaters now? And kind of what is the viability of that? Like, what are your thoughts on that? If you have Disney purchasing theaters, and Amazon and Apple, and how does that work?
Yeah, that's, well, now that they can, I think that Disney already owns the El Capitan Theater on
Mhm.
Hollywood Boulevard. So I think kind of a one-off thing. But from the question, could they buy AMC financially and all that? I don't know that they're in a position to do that, but could they? Yes. And what would that look like? It's a tough one because you think of, well, Disney owns their own chain of theaters, or Universal owns their own chain of theaters. They're only going to show those other movies. Um, and then what does that do to independent theaters? And that's a question actually. We're tonight we're doing an interview with a manager of a local theater here
Oh, okay.
outside of Seattle, and to talk to him about that exact thing. You know, does that mean that independent theaters are going to have to kind of make their own little niche to be,
Yeah.
show independent films or whichever? Um, yeah, I don't know. It's got the potential to really change things up, but I don't know if, because then you've got, all right, the Disney theater chain, which you would assume, if they bought AMC and had that many theaters, that many screens, well, they can't just show all
Yeah.
Disney movies, but that would obviously be if they have an IMAX screen, the
Mhm.
IMAX is going to be Disney, whereas the other screens wouldn't be. Um, and then you could start to see some. I mean, yeah, honestly, you could start to see some more lawsuits
Mhm.
against that. So, yeah, I don't. It's going to be interesting because there's a number of ways that could play out, and we are in a different culture now than we were back in the 1940s when corporations were not held to as high of an account as they are now,
Mhm.
with the press. And it's like anything else in our culture and society. Everything's so visible now, and everything's so scrutinized that I don't know that they'd be able to get away with those kind of big monopolistic things that they did before.
Yeah, and I originally, after listening to that episode of the podcast, I thought, okay, is this a situation where Disney owns, Universal owns, Apple, Amazon, and then so they have their first run movies, but then after, let's say Disney releases something and 2 weeks later, then it's part of the negotiations where they're releasing in other theaters as well. And Amazon is releasing, or Netflix is releasing something, and then 2 weeks later it can be released in these other theaters as well. And it's that then it also has to do with what does happen, what is the future with going to brick and mortar theaters. Is it How long is it going to be until people feel comfortable going back to theaters and going
Hmm.
back to theaters the way that we did pre-pandemic, where there was very little concern about what was happening at the theater? Are people going to return to that? Are people going to continue to want to stream at home and watch at home because it's safer, and I mean it's more convenient, and it is financially more viable for individuals, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, and it's interesting because we talked about the fact that if Netflix owns, or we'll say if Disney owns a chain of theaters, well, now you can maybe not just have their movies, but you can go see The Mandalorian, to sit an
Mhm.
afternoon and watch an entire season of Mandalorian at a theater. But I don't know if there's the appetite for that. Um, I could see where it could be possible. We referenced the old, Saturday matinee serials that they used to have back, in black and white days. And I remember my dad talking about going to see what the Western, and it was a serial every week at the
Mhm.
theater. Um, but while I just don't know, because you look at the younger generations, and I watch, my son, and everything's on the phone,
Mhm.
um, and everything's on these smaller devices, and you wonder if that would be going away anyway because of
Yeah.
that. I mean, I love going to the theater. I don't know that my son likes it as much as I do. And as generations go on, it could this could accelerate that sea change that we were probably going to see anyway.
Yeah. One kind of aside, I wonder if people building personal theaters in their, theater rooms in their houses, if this situation has kind of increased people wanting to do that, because it is now, hey, what do we like about going to a theater? Everybody likes something different, but if you think about as a family, here's what we like, and here we like the comfortable chairs or whatever. And, you know, it's just off the top of my head. I'm wondering if people have thought, hey, well, why don't we just do that at home? Because everything we we need is right here. And then occasionally we'll go out to a brick and mortar theater. So
Yeah, yeah. I think, I mean, for me personally, there are certain films you almost have to see in a theater. The superhero films. I remember when we went to see Gravity. It was that 7 years ago. You know, and that we saw that in IMAX, and you're surrounded. I mean, it was just a phenomenal experience. So I think you're always going to have that. That there's certain films that you're going to want to see in the theater. But to your point, it's so cheap now to set up a theater at home. I
mhm,
remember the first we bought a 65-inch television 15 years ago, and it was $4,000 or
yeah,
something. It's one of those rear projection, monstrosities. And now you can go to Costco and get a 90-inch TV
yeah,
for $1,800 or something like that. And the home theater system and all of that. Um, and you don't have to worry. People, have to go to the bathroom. You pause, and
yeah.
and whatever. So, I mean, it's tough, but yeah, I think you make a good point that there's probably a lot of people that are saying, hey, I can get the theater experience here at home and control it more and spend a lot less money.
Yeah, and it was interesting over the summer that when Disney Plus released Hamilton, um, and it did have that intermission and kind of that I remember thinking how many kids are used to just pausing and they leave the room and they pause and then like that's not the way that it always worked. That you walk out of a movie theater, you're going to miss some. You walk out of
Hmm.
a live performance, and some performances you don't make it back in time. You have to wait 5 or 15
Yep.
minutes to get back in.
Yep.
So there's one last segment, kind of rapid fire questions that I like to ask our class guests now. But anything else you want to say about what you do with the company, about what we were just talking about with the future of streaming and what that means before we transition?
Well, the one thing I'll say about the company is, and I used to represent Disney at some career fairs at Washington State, and we'd have people from every major come up to us and ask, "Hey, is there a job at Disney for this major or that major?" And the one thing we always said is, "There's a job at Disney for every major you can imagine, from creative to veterinarians to paralegals." So so if you're interested, if you're the kind of fan that would like to work at Disney, there's plenty of opportunities. And obviously, right now, nobody's hiring, but coming out of it, I mean, those opportunities are going to open back up again. Um, and it's I have not had the experience where somebody said, "Well, you're going to work for Disney and you're going to lose the magic because you're going to see the kind of the behind the scenes." I like seeing the behind the scenes stuff, and
Yeah.
I think more and more you see people that watch on Disney Plus those behind the scenes shows, days with one day at Disney and things like that. And I think more and more people are interested in seeing what goes on behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you. I
Yeah.
think that's as we move forward, I think people do like seeing kind of what goes into, you know, in Disney's case, what goes into creating the magic.
Yep. And I'm trying to for our podcast. I'm reaching out to some of the folks I know. We had the opportunity to when I was in Burbank a couple of years ago, go down to a studio lab, which is where they
Mm.
test drive a lot of the technology that they use for films. And there's some of the stuff there that's secret, but there's a lot that's open to the public, or not open to the public, but public knowledge. And I'm
Yeah.
trying to get somebody there to come onto our podcast and talk about some of the stuff
Yeah.
they
And
do about virtual reality and things like that.
yeah, that would be fantastic. I think that on that note, could you let the students and anyone listening know where they could find the podcast, where they could follow you to get more information on the podcast or about what you're doing.
Sure. So we're on Facebook. So it's Heilman and Haver, Heilman and Haver. The podcast is available on anywhere you get your podcasts: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, um, Pandora. Not sure about Pandora. I'd have to check that. If it's not, we'll get it out there. But yeah, so just give a search on it, and give it a listen. And we're trying to, like I said, we interview local actors and directors, but as we move forward, we're going to try to hopefully branch out into some people in other regions and that as well.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. That it's a great podcast, and I love listening to it. I love the way that you two interact and you interact with the guests is very it's very easy to listen to on my walks and when I'm doing other things. So
Thanks, appreciate it.
yeah, no, it's great. So there are a few rapid fire questions if you have a little bit of time.
Yep.
So these just kind of off the top of your head, first thing that comes to your mind. You live in Seattle, Washington. Do you have a favorite park in the United States?
I Disneyland Park.
Disneyland?
And yeah, and I grew up going to Florida all the time. And the first time we went to Disneyland, I was struck by how small it was. But you're really overwhelmed by the amount of history that's there, and it's
Mhm.
really, I like the smallness makes it quaint.
Yeah.
So yeah, so if I had to choose, if I could only go to one park, it would be Disneyland in California.
And we actually were going to scheduled to go to a conference in May in San Diego, and we're going to take a few days to go up to Anaheim, and obviously that didn't happen with everything going on right now. So I have yet to go to Disneyland, but I know when I'm able to go, it's just going to be this mix of excitement and then just awe of what actually happened here. Being the only park that he's the creator Walt Disney stepped foot in.
Yeah,
So
it's interesting that I always find myself comparing though too,
yeah,
because the first thing you want, man, that castle is small, and that compared to the one of the Magic Kingdom, but yeah, then you start to go into the attractions. Well, is Pirates better here? Is it better there? It's kind of interesting how that always works out.
so the next thing is what, and this could be any park, East Coast, West Coast, international, it doesn't matter. What is your favorite attraction, ride attraction? Because we'll get to show next.
Can we call a monorail an attraction?
Yeah, yeah.
Because that to me, even though you don't pay for it, is when I worked. I'll put it this way: when I worked at Amazon, we were building some. I was program manager for Prime Now, which is the 1 hour delivery, and we were doing a bunch of sites in Orlando. And one night, I didn't go into the parks, but I just drove over and parked and rode the monorail for, I don't know, 2 hours. Always been my favorite part of it. The actual steam train would probably be my second one, and then the Wedway People Mover, or now it's Tomorrowland Transit
Yeah.
Authority would be third, but definitely the monorail.
So I think People Mover is probably my favorite because I love riding through Tomorrowland and just the music and
Hmm.
ambiance and everything. But the monorail definitely counts because that was actually technology that the company was developing for sell outside or use outside of the parks as well. And I didn't know this growing up, but I grew up in Houston, outside of Houston, and we would go to the Houston Bush, which is now Bush Intercontinental Airport, and just ride the monorail back and forth. Their kind of monorail system, and that's
Yep.
actually the only monorail that the Walt Disney Company sold. It wasn't their subsidiary sold for use outside of the parks. Um,
Yeah. And it's interesting out here in Seattle. They had the World's Fair with the monorail. The monorail still the old all-weg monorail. So the same company that built the original one in Disneyland, they still have the original trains out here that go out to the where the World's Fair used to be.
mhm.
And the tracks that were built for the Magic Kingdom loop in Florida were actually manufactured out here in Tacoma
Huh,
and
okay.
shipped down over truck. So that's interesting connection
Y-
between the Seattle area and the Florida area.
Yeah. So next we said we would do attraction shows. Favorite any park, the favorite attraction show. That's a show.
Oh boy, probably the Hoop De Doo review.
Okay.
Been there a bunch of times. Always love it. Love the food. It's one of those you can see so many times and just never get tired of it.
Okay. Favorite, you mentioned food, favorite restaurant in any of the parks or properties.
Oh boy. One place we go. Well, so we always go to the Carnation Cafe in Disneyland on Main Street. That's always our first stop when we go down there. And the nice thing is, we fly from Seattle. It's like a 2-hour flight. We can be there for lunch.
Mm, yeah.
Same day. But probably the favorite, California Grill.
Okay.
Um, and it's expensive, but that was, I know my wife and I did our honeymoon back in '97, in Walt Disney World, and that was probably our favorite meal then, was at the California Grill. I mean, I remember back when I was a kid, and that was the top of the world restaurant. You
Yeah.
get your buffet breakfast there, all that. But yeah, I saw California Grill.
So, and here's something near and dear to my heart. When I go into the parks, I do a lot of um, fast service, but I also do a lot of the treats as well. Your favorite treat at any of the parks?
Mickey ice cream bar.
I would definitely agree with that. I do say on this last visit, this was admittedly, it's a little embarrassing to admit, it was the first time I had a Dole Whip, and I ended up having, I think, 3 or 4 of them while I was there. But I definitely can agree with the Mickey ice cream bars, and we have a stocked freezer of those now that they sell them in our
Yeah,
local stores.
that's pretty awesome. They started doing that.
Yeah. Last thing that this could be within the parks, this could be outside of the parks. Favorite Disney character?
Donald Duck.
Donald Duck.
Yep. Close second is probably Oswald, the Lucky Rabbit.
Hmm.
And my son loves Oswald. That's my son's favorite. So we've kind of got a soft place for him, but it's always been Donald.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining the class. And I'll make sure that the students have your information, students and listeners have your information, and what will be the show notes. Thank you very much for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, Cody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.